The sand is white enough to blind. The air is heavy, pressed down by a noon sun that seems to erase shadows instead of casting them. Each grain is a tiny heat reservoir, storing morning light and releasing it back as shimmer. Just above the tide line, the beach becomes a thermal cliff, hotter than the sea beside it, hotter than the wind moving over it, sometimes hot enough to burn exposed human skin in seconds. And yet, in this stripped, exposed world, movement begins. Small, pale crabs break cover and start to travel, quick, deliberate, almost mechanical, across open sand where there is no shelter and no mercy. Their legs tap the surface like needles on a drum. Their bodies cast only a thin, fragile shade beneath them. To step out now is to accept dehydration, overheating, and the attention of predators that can see them from far away. Today, we're diving into why crabs choose to march into beach's deadliest heat, why evolution, again and again, pushes living animals toward moments that look like recklessness, but are in fact strategy. On a beach, the danger is not only temperature, it is time. For a crab living at the edge of land and sea, ghost crabs of the genus Ossipode on ocean beaches, land crabs that must reach the coast to reproduce, intertidal crabs that feed in brief windows. Life is governed by tight schedules, written by tides, humidity, and predators. A beach is not a stable habitat, it is a moving boundary. Food arrives in pulses. Safety opens and closes like a door. Ghost crabs spend much of the day hidden in burrows, and for good reason. Their bodies are ectothermic. Their temperature follows the world around them. The surface of a sunlit beach can swing through extreme thermal changes in hours, and the upper shore, where these crabs live, is exposed to both desiccation and heat stress. Yet, the burrow is not simply a hiding place. It is a climate machine. Measurements of ghost crab burrows show that the thermal relationship between the burrow entrance and the surrounding sand flips across the day. In early morning, the burrow can be warmer than the surface. By mid-afternoon, it becomes noticeably cooler, a refuge carved into a hostile landscape. This reversal of thermal gradients is not a trivial detail. It means the burrow is a programmable buffer against extremes, a place where a crab can wait out lethal conditions and then re-enter the world when the numbers tilt back in its favor. Source. But crabs do not stay underground forever. They cannot. Their food is outside, and on beaches, food is often concentrated in a narrow band, the rack line where seaweed, carrion, and organic debris wash up, the swash zone where waves churn microscopic life, the intertidal flats where algae films and detritus can be scraped and sifted. The timing of access matters because the shoreline itself moves, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. For a foraging crab, the heat is a cost, but hunger is a deadline. That trade-off becomes sharper when the best feeding opportunities occur precisely when conditions are worst. On many sandy shores, ghost crabs are predominantly nocturnal, but their activity is not a single rule stamped across all coasts. Studies and field observations show that activity patterns can vary by species, location, and local pressures. Availability of food, risk from predators, and human disturbance can all reshape when a crab dares to emerge. Even in systems where night foraging dominates, individuals still make daylight excursions for maintenance, repositioning, or opportunistic feeding when conditions align. What matters is not the clock. It is the equation. How much energy can be gained and how much risk must be paid. Source. To understand why marching into heat can make evolutionary sense, you have to see the beach as a mosaic of microclimates, not a flat surface. The temperature you feel at ankle height is not the temperature a crab experiences at the boundary layer hugging the sand. A few centimeters of elevation, longer legs, a different stance, can change convective cooling. A few centimeters of depth, down a burrow, can change everything. The beach is layered like atmosphere and ocean, thin strata of survivability stacked on top of one another. And so the first answer is surprisingly simple. Crabs do not choose heat because they tolerate it. They choose it because they can negotiate it. They negotiate with behavior first. When surface temperatures climb, a crab's most powerful adaptation is movement between thermal zones, into shade, into damp sand, into a burrow, back out again. In intertidal crabs, this behavioral thermoregulation is measurable and strategic. Field work on fiddler crabs shows that individuals begin using burrows to regulate body temperature at body temperatures far below lethal limits, around the mid-20s Celsius in one system, because waiting until near death is not an option. Thermoregulation has costs. Time in a burrow is time not feeding, not courting, not defending territory. But the behavior begins early because the consequences of overheating are nonlinear. Once proteins denature and physiology collapses, there is no bargain left to strike. Source on beaches. Similar logic applies even when the species differs. Ghost crabs can retreat to deeper, cooler layers, and the thermal profiles of burrows demonstrate why this is effective. At the surface, sunlight drives rapid heating. Below, temperatures are more stable, insulated by sand. The crab's body gains and loses heat quickly, an advantage when it can dash out, grab something, and retreat before internal temperatures climb too far. In effect, the crab turns the burrow into a battery of coolness, spending it in short bursts to purchase time on the surface. Source. But behavior alone doesn't explain the march, because sometimes the crabs move not for food, but for something that cannot be postponed. Reproduction is one of the most powerful forces that drives animals into danger. On Christmas Island, the red crab Gecarcoidea natalis, a land crab, undertakes an annual breeding migration from forest burrows toward the sea. The scale is famous. Millions of crabs moving across roads, through heat, across exposed ground. Yet the physiology behind the spectacle is more instructive than the spectacle itself. During migration, researchers examining respiratory gases and metabolites find that the journey is accomplished aerobically, without needing to resort to anaerobic metabolism, despite sustained walking and the physiological demands of terrestrial life. The crabs manage oxygen transport well enough that hemocyanin remains saturated, and they do not show the classic metabolic crash you might expect from a prolonged march. In other words, the migration is not a mass panic. It is a seasonal performance, tuned to conditions and supported by physiology. Source. Even so, the study reveals a deeper truth. The migration itself is not always the most demanding part. The real physiological crisis can come from the battles for burrows in which breeding occurs. Short bursts of violent combat that drive severe anaerobiosis and lactate spikes. The march is not the only danger. It is one phase in a sequence where timing and location determine which stresses dominate. Source. This is how extreme environments shape evolution, not by requiring constant toughness, but by requiring flexibility across different kinds of stress. Heat on the sand, dehydration in the air, hypoxia inside crowded burrows, sudden exertion during fights, and always the need to return to the sea to complete a life cycle that still depends on water. The beach is full of these life cycle obligations. Consider the broader pattern across crabs. Again and again, species that live near the boundary between land and sea evolve partial solutions. Semi-terrestrial respiration, behavioral thermoregulation, burrow engineering, because they are pulled by opposing necessities. To feed, to mate, to disperse, to avoid predators, to avoid heat. The march is the visible part of a hidden budget, and that budget is now being rewritten by climate. When temperatures shift, the edges of habitability shift too, not only day to day, but geographically, across decades. Ghost crabs are unusually useful for detecting these changes, because they leave visible, countable burrows, and occupy a clear zone on beaches. Work on range edges of ghost crabs on warming coasts shows how their distributions can extend poleward, and how recruitment can occur beyond where adults can survive winters, suggesting that the bottleneck may be not dispersal, but the ability to endure temperature extremes. The implication is unsettling. If warming continues, crabs may expand into new areas, but they may also face new thermal ceilings, where their existing strategies, burrow refuge, timing shifts, stop being enough. Source. This matters because a beach is not just hot, it is increasingly unpredictable. Heat waves do not simply raise averages, they compress safe windows. They turn the surface into a trap for longer stretches of the day. And for an ectotherm, a few degrees can be the difference between a brief sprint and a fatal exposure. So why do they still come out? Because the alternative is often worse. A crab that stays in its burrow avoids the sun, but it also forfeits food, territory maintenance, and mating opportunities. In many species, those forfeitures are not equal. Missing a meal can be survivable. Missing a reproductive window may not be. Missing a chance to secure a burrow or defend a position can have cascading effects. Loss of shelter, loss of future thermoregulation capacity, loss of safety. The burrow is not just refuge, it is an asset, and assets must be maintained. In fiddler crab systems, research explicitly frames burrow use as a trade-off, because time spent thermoregulating can reduce feeding and courtship. Importantly, the onset of thermoregulatory burrow use happens well below critical thermal limits, suggesting that the costs accumulate long before obvious danger. Warming, then, does not only kill animals outright, it taxes them quietly by forcing them to spend more time hiding and less time doing the behaviors that keep populations stable. Source. On open beaches, ghost crabs face similar arithmetic. They can sprint, they can retreat, they can exploit cooler sand at depth. But when food arrives at the rack line after a tide, when a rival's burrow must be challenged, when a female must be found, the crab may accept a short exposure to deadly heat because the expected gain outweighs the expected loss, especially if the crab has evolved to make that exposure brief, directional, and recoverable. That brings us to the most important evolutionary layer. Selection does not reward comfort, it rewards outcomes. If a subset of crabs consistently times their excursions poorly, they die, leaving fewer descendants. If another subset calibrates activity with microclimates, using burrows as thermal shelters, emerging when the tide delivers food, retreating before internal temperatures cross damaging thresholds, those individuals persist. Over generations, behaviors that look like choosing heat can be the emergent result of many smaller optimizations. Burrow depth, leg length, sprint capacity, sensory cues for temperature and humidity, and the internal physiology that decides when the cost has become too high. The beach, then, becomes a testing ground for decision-making without cognition as we usually imagine it. A crab does not need foresight. It needs thresholds, rules shaped by selection. And still, even with all this, uncertainty remains. We can measure burrow temperatures and see thermal reversals across the day. We can track how body temperature changes with surface temperature and infer when an animal begins to thermoregulate. We can map shifting range edges and connect them to warming trends. We can document the physiology of migrations that force terrestrial crabs back to the sea. Source, 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 source. But the fine details, the exact sensory triggers that make one crab run now and another wait, the way hydration status interacts with thermal limits minute by minute, the hidden costs of heat on reproduction and immunity, those are harder to see. They play out in small bodies, in short windows, in places where the environment shifts faster than instruments can be everywhere at once. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning of the march into heat. It is not bravado. It is life negotiating with physics. On a beach at noon, the sun is indifferent. The sand does not care what it burns. The tide does not slow for any animal. Yet these crabs keep moving, because evolution has built them not to conquer the heat, but to thread the needle through it, again and again, in a world that offers no stable ground. As the planet warms, that needle narrows. We will likely see more crabs forced into deeper burrows, shorter foraging windows, altered migrations, new ranges, and new failures. Quiet collapses that happen not with drama, but with missed chances. And we will still be left with questions that cut close to the limits of our understanding. How much of adaptation is flexibility? And how much is an illusion of safety borrowed from a microclimate that can disappear in a single extreme day? The next time the beach looks empty at noon, imagine what is happening beneath your feet. Living animals waiting in thin pockets of survivable air, measuring the world in degrees and seconds, deciding by rules written over millions of years, when the deadliest heat is worth crossing.